We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident.
Frances told me a few years later that she was sort of thrilled at the way that Diana sort of freed herself, as she saw it, from the shackles of royalty and from being a member of the royal family.
On the last day of August in 1997, the world watched a car leave the Ritz in Paris. Everyone knows how that story ends. But 16 years later, in a quiet lab in Edinburgh, a very different story about Princess Diana began, one that had nothing to do with Paris or Charles or the crash. It began with 2 vials of saliva and a question nobody had thought to ask: who was hiding at the very root of Diana's family tree? The answer would upend 2 centuries of carefully maintained family history, and it would eventually reach all the way to the future King of England. In 2013, a geneticist named Jim Wilson, based at the University of Edinburgh and working with the Ancestry testing firm Britain's DNA, was chasing a hunch. He had come across a name buried deep in Diana's family records, Eliza Kawark, a woman who had always been labeled Armenian, but who, oddly, had spent her entire life in Western India. Something about that didn't sit right with him. Why would a woman with an Armenian identity be living and working in Bombay 100 years before independence, with no other Armenian family around her? Wilson decided to test it. He tracked down 2 women who were both third cousins of Diana's mother, Frances Shan Kidd, and who shared an unbroken line of mothers stretching back to Eliza. Wilson wasn't interested in ordinary DNA for this test. He wanted mitochondrial DNA, specifically the small loop of genetic material that a mother passes to her children, essentially unchanged generation after generation. Fathers don't contribute to it at all. It travels in one direction only down the maternal line, like a genetic fingerprint that no marriage, no adoption of a new name, and no rewritten family history can alter. Most of your DNA is a shuffled mix of both parents, reshuffled again with every generation, but mitochondrial DNA sidesteps that process almost entirely. A mother passes it to all of her children, but only her daughters pass it on again. It means a single narrow thread of ancestry can be traced back with remarkable precision, completely untouched by everyone who ever married into the family along the way. What Wilson found in that mitochondrial DNA stopped him. Both women carried a marker belonging to a haplogroup known as R30b, a genetic signature so rare that out of tens of thousands of samples in genetic databases worldwide, it had turned up in only a small handful of other people, almost all of them from India, with a single case from Nepal. There was no version of that marker native to Europe. None. It meant that somewhere in Diana's direct maternal ancestry, an Indian woman had to exist, not a rumor, not a guess, but a biological certainty written into the cells of 2 independent, unrelated relatives who got the same result. That woman was Eliza Kawark. She was born around 1790 in Surat, a trading port on India's western coast, in what is now Gujarat. Surat at that time was one of the busiest commercial crossroads in the region, a city where ships from Europe, Persia, the Gulf, and across Asia all put in to trade. Merchant communities from dozens of backgrounds lived side by side there, and it was common for those communities to intermarry and blend across cultural lines in a way that would have been far less accepted in, say, London or Edinburgh. Eliza's father is believed to have been an Armenian trader, which is likely where her surname came from. Armenian merchant families had been settled in parts of India for generations by that point, but nothing in the historical record says anything about her mother. The DNA now filled in that gap. Whatever her father's background, the woman who gave Eliza life, and who gave Diana her mitochondrial DNA 9 generations later, was of South Asian origin. It's worth pausing on why that single fact carried so much weight in the world Eliza was born into. Mixed heritage was an everyday reality in a port city like Surat, but the British Empire in India was, by the early 19th century, moving away from the relative social flexibility of its earlier decades and toward a much stricter racial hierarchy. A relationship or a parentage that might have drawn little comment a generation earlier could, by the 1810s and 1820s, become a serious liability for a British man trying to build a respectable career. That shift in colonial attitude sits at the center of everything that happened to Eliza next. Around 1809, a young Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes arrived in Surrey to work for the East India Company. Forbes came from a landowning family near Aberdeen and had ambitions of building a career and a fortune in India. He hired Eliza, and the working relationship between them became something much more personal. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter, Catherine, born in 1812, and a son, Alexander, born a couple of years later. For a time, they lived together as a family, first in Surat and later in Mocha, in present-day Yemen, where Theodore took up a post overseeing British trading interests. Historical accounts describe Eliza as far more than a housekeeper during this period. She is said to have helped Theodore navigate local languages and relationships in a role closer to that of a partner than an employee. But as Theodore's career advanced, so did the pressure of colonial society's rules. When he took a prestigious new position back in Bombay, he chose to leave Eliza and the children behind. British colonial society at the time was hardening into rigid racial and social hierarchies, and a mixed-race partner was, by the standards of the era, a liability to a rising company man. Theodore built a new social life among British colonial circles in Bombay, largely apart from the family he had started in Surat. When Theodore died in 1820, his will described Eliza only as his housekeeper and named Catherine his reputed daughter. Legal language designed to keep any real claim at arm's length. Catherine, only about 8 years old, was sent by ship to Scotland to be raised among Theodore's relatives. She never returned to India, and by most accounts, she never saw her mother again. Her younger brother Alexander did make the same journey, but reportedly struggled so much with homesickness that he was eventually sent back to India, while Catherine remained in Scotland and was raised within the Forbes family, growing up largely disconnected from the country and the mother she'd left behind. Long after Theodore's death, a collection of letters written by Eliza was found among family papers at the Forbes estate in Scotland. According to accounts from biographers who have examined them, the letters, written with the help of a scribe since Eliza's own English was limited, expressed a mother's repeated pleas to be allowed contact with her daughter. Whether or not those pleas were ever answered isn't entirely clear from the historical record, but Catherine's path was already set. She grew up in Scotland, was absorbed into British aristocratic life, and eventually married well. From Catherine, the maternal line continued unbroken, daughter to daughter to daughter, through the 19th and 20th centuries, eventually producing Frances Shan Kidd, and then on the 1st of July 1961, a baby girl born at Park House near the Sandringham estate, Diana Frances Spencer. For generations, the official story told about Eliza Kawark inside the Spencer family and in published genealogies was simple. She was Armenian. It's a plausible-sounding explanation, since Eliza's father likely did have Armenian roots, and Eliza herself signed her letters using Armenian script. In the social context of the British Empire, Armenian was a far more acceptable label than Indian, closer to a footnote than a scandal, since Armenians were generally viewed within the empire as European adjacent and Christian, while South Asian ancestry carried a very different, and far less forgiving, set of assumptions among the British aristocracy. Whether that label was a deliberate cover story invented by a family member or a solicitor, or simply an assumption that took root early and was never questioned, is something historians still debate. Either way, it held for close to 200 years, repeated in biography after biography, church records, and marriage registers, without serious challenge, right through Diana's wedding to Prince Charles in 1981, watched by an estimated global audience of hundreds of millions, none of whom heard anything about India. That's what makes the 2013 findings so remarkable. It wasn't a rumor finally confirmed or a long-suspected secret finally proven. For most of the family, it was a complete surprise. The story people had told each other at family gatherings for generations, and the story written into their own cells, had simply never been compared against each other until a scientist, with a hunch, decided to ask the question. When the 2013 DNA results became public, they didn't just rewrite a genealogical footnote. They revealed something the family itself apparently didn't know. Diana's own aunt, interviewed after the findings came out, reportedly said she had always understood the family to be part Armenian and was pleasantly surprised to learn of an Indian background as well. It's a striking detail, An entire family had spent generations passing down both a story and a set of genes at the same time, without realizing that the biology told a completely different story than the folklore. There's an added layer of irony buried in all of this. When Diana's engagement to Prince Charles was announced in 1981, the genealogical authority Burke's Peerage pointed out that Diana actually carried more English royal bloodlines than Charles did, though that royal blood came largely through several mistresses of King Charles II, whose descendants quietly married into the aristocracy over the following centuries. So the family that had spent 200 years anxious about a supposedly damaging secret from India was, by the standards of the very system they were protecting, already more thoroughly linked to the English crown than the man Diana was marrying. The genetic story doesn't stop with Diana, because mitochondrial DNA passes directly from mother to child. Both of Diana's sons, William and Harry, inherited the same R30b marker that can be traced straight back to Eliza Kawark in Surat. Researchers involved in the 2013 study noted it's likely that whatever small percentage of South Asian ancestry showed up in the autosomal DNA of Diana's tested relatives, estimated at under 1%, would be reflected in William and Harry as well. It made William, as the heir apparent, the first person in line for the British throne with a documented, if distant, genetic connection to South Asia. Notable given that the Commonwealth includes well over 1 billion people of South Asian descent. But there's a quieter, more permanent twist to how this story ends. Mitochondrial DNA only travels from mother to child. A father, no matter how strong the genetic link he carries, cannot pass it on to his own children. William and Harry both carry Eliza's marker, but their children won't. George, Charlotte, and Louis will inherit their mitochondrial DNA from their mother, Catherine, not from William, and the same is true down Harry's line. Which means that after 9 generations, after surviving a transoceanic voyage, an empire's racial hierarchies, an abandoned mother's unanswered letters, and 2 centuries of a family quietly rewriting its own history, the direct genetic thread back to Eliza Kawark simply stops with William and Harry. Not through scandal, not through any dramatic reveal, just through the ordinary, unchangeable mechanics of biology. It's a strange kind of ending for a story that was hidden for so long. For 200 years, a family's official record insisted Eliza Kawark was someone she wasn't. Her name barely survived in the archives, tucked away in letters nobody read, and a will that reduced her to a job title. And yet the one thing that no document, no social pressure, and no polite Victorian euphemism could ever erase was already written into the cells of every one of her descendants, waiting patiently for 200 years until the science finally caught up enough to read it. Eliza Kawark never got to see her daughter again after Catherine's ship left for Scotland. She never knew her name would one day be tied to a princess or to a future king. But in the most literal, biological sense possible, she never actually left the family at all. She was there in Diana. She's there in William. And for one more generation, before the mitochondrial thread finally runs out, she's there still, the housekeeper from Surat who the record books tried to erase, and who DNA, in the end, refused to let go.